Hey guys, it's Asia, and welcome back to the Web Design Decal. Hopefully, you had a good spring break. We're going to jump straight into human centered design. So, human centered design is a design approach that incorporates the human perspective, basically, considering what works best for humans, the way that humans think, and the way that they interact with technology. So, why is learning about human-centered design important? Basically, it allows us to make things more useful and effective and just improving our lives as a whole, because empathizing with others and understanding how we really work allows us to make things that really work in our favor and aren't frustrating or difficult for us to use. We've touched on some of the general human-centered design ideas in some of our other lectures, such as the redesign process and the first lecture introducing design as a whole. So, human-centered design follows a nonlinear process to allow for iteration until you achieve the best results. So, it encompasses 4 main steps: analysis, design, evaluation, and implementation. And as you can see by the arrows, there's a lot of iteration, and all of the steps are interdependent on one another. And you can repeat the sequence pretty much as many times as you need to in order to create the best results based on your research and based on what seems to work for people. But we'll get into more of that later in the lecture. So, the analysis section includes user research, basically getting to know your users and figuring out what's best for them. So, basically understanding humans, like I mentioned. From doing your research, you define the problem space, because once you understand the users, you understand what they need. In general, guiding principles to how you design the product. So the second part of it is design, as I mentioned. So you ideate based on your research, based on your knowledge of what users are like, and based on your knowledge of how we interact with products in general. And that helps you understand how to develop the interactions, the visuals, etc. with your product. So next there's evaluation, which is user testing. So you have ideas and maybe you narrow down the ideas, but after that you need to see if your ideas are good. So you go back to your users and you're like, hey, is this good? And if your idea isn't good, you can go back to the ideation stage and back to the evaluation stage. It's that nonlinear process I was talking about. Then from user testing and evaluation, you go to implementation. So you've iterated over your ideation and testing, and you're pretty confident in your idea, so you can finally bring it to high fidelity and produce it. So you make the wireframes, you make the high fidelity mock-ups, and the interaction all solidified, and you make the final product and release it. But once you do that, you can continue doing user research and continue doing user testing and improve your product even after it's released. So now we're going to go through each of the steps. We're in sub-steps within the HCD process. So we're going to start with user research. So user research helps you learn about your users, but how can you do that? So some of the best ways are interviews. You talk to people and they tell you their stories and experiences, and it really narrows down into what their feelings and interactions are as they go through using products, or just that section of their life. For example, if you're interviewing about their experience from walking from one place to another. They might tell you, oh, there are tons of stairs, it's really inconvenient if they're disabled, or if it's just tiring because there's a lot of them, or the stairs aren't designed well. It doesn't even have to be technology based. Contextual inquiry is a type of interview. So basically, you follow your users throughout their day or throughout some task, and you have them coach you through it, and you ask them questions while they're doing their normal day-to-day things, and it really helps you observe and see the process and emotions that they go through throughout the day. There are also surveys, which is a large neutral scan. So if you need a lot of just statistical data for your product, surveys can be really helpful for sifting out insights from a large user base. There's also card sorting, which is writing down a bunch of topics or ideas on cards, and you observe how the user groups them and explains their thoughts on those ideas. And then finally, there's desk research, which is just reading and studying. You might look at competitor companies or competitor products, or maybe you just read up on the study of the psychology of people interacting with their finances or with a certain type of aspect of our lives. And that can help you gain insight in what you should be asking your users and the other sorts of groups of user research methods. So some general rules of thumb for using them are empathy, neutrality, and simplicity. For empathy, you want to make sure that you consider what information they would be comfortable with sharing, how much time it's taking, what might be important to them. Neutrality, you don't want to push them in any one way or railroad them to a certain decision. And lastly, you want to keep it simple so that they understand the question and you get clear answers and you get what you want to know. So then defining the problem. You might hear this, how might we question? Phrasing it as how might we, or stating the problem as a how might we question, helps designers focus in on what the problem they're trying to solve. So how might we help the homeless population transfer their belongings more easily, for example? And then you would ideate on what are solutions to this problem? How might we fix this problem? And you generally hone down the scope of this question and the specificity of it based on your research and iteration in testing to know what's truly important, what your focus is within the project. So in ideation, this is really where you are trying to solve the problem. You know what it needs to include, you know what the user needs. It's now time for you to create ideas. So first you synthesize your findings from your research and from talking to the users. So if there's a clear group of users with similar experiences, maybe it's a similar goal or similar demographic, you want to make personas, so characters representing each group. Here's some examples of it. It has like jobs, title, status, location, some about information, and they can be as detailed as you need them to be. There are tons of examples of this on the internet, and I highly encourage you to read through them. Another method of synthesizing your findings is making a journey map. If there's a clear process your users seem to follow, for example, how they might learn about resources on campus, you can make a timeline of their user experience. They see a flyer and then they ask their advisor about it and then they get involved or something like that. So You want to consider what actions the user would take, their emotions during this time, their stress levels, opportunities for the company, what kind of person goes through this journey, and many other things like that. This link that I have attached is particularly helpful in explaining journey mapping, and there are many different ways to do it depending on what you're working on. To find key insights, no matter what your project is, and to just narrow down ideas that you have while you're coming up with solutions, is to do affinity mapping. So basically writing down ideas and observations that you have on post-its and grouping them. This is a really good way to find trends and repeating insights and things like that when you're sifting through your research or sifting through your own ideas. What is similar? What do you think is a good idea for this project? Yeah, as I said, it's the most important one that you should do, no matter what your project is. So here's a picture of it. It has a bunch of different things written down on post-its. You can also group them by circling them or putting them in separate groups. It really helps to see everything spread out like this. Medium has a lot of good resources on how to do this well or how to do it strategically. A couple rules of thumb with ideation: be empathetic. That is the main goal of human-centered design. Put the user needs above what you think is a cool design, because if you make something that is cool to you, other people might not be able to access it or find it as intuitive as you do. You also want to be observant, so notice repetition and trends, edge cases, the emotions of your user. You also want to be open, so what haven't you considered? Don't just go for the first idea that you think of. You also want to be inclusive, so think about accessibility. Who haven't you considered? What user groups are also important to consider throughout working on your project. So now we're moving on to user testing. So this is super important for optimizing your product. So you have an idea maybe, or you're trying to figure out which idea is best. User testing is a great way to narrow this down and kind of fix any issues with it. So some methods for user testing are guerrilla testing. So basically going up to random people in public and asking them to test your product. Usually a good idea when doing this is to offer them some kind of reward for doing this. Also, please be careful doing it. Also, for more in-depth personal testing, you want to use contextual inquiry, like we mentioned for user research. It's kind of similar. Now that you have a product or a problem in mind, you can ask questions based on this product or this problem. Then a moderated usability test is based on the product. Ask the user to do tasks that you assign to them based on their actions and their interactions with it. But for larger scale testing, unmoderated or remote usability tests are best, since they organically and naturally interact with the application and send you feedback back. But unfortunately, the last form of usability testing doesn't give you as in-depth of feedback as the other options. So the next step after you've user tested and ideated and done your user research, you combine all of those things to do prototyping and fabrication. So this is where you make your high fidelity product. In this picture, I have some prototypes of, I think they're buildings, architectural prototypes, and they don't have to be out of the same material that you'll be making it out of in the final product, but you basically learn how your materials are going to work, how your interaction is going to work if it's an app, and the general look and design aspects that we've covered so far. So yeah, here's a sketch version of planning out, or a storyboard, basically planning out the different interactions between windows in an app from Career Foundry. It's also a good resource. Basically what we've covered in terms of UI UX design and thinking about the redesign lecture that I gave. You create the high fidelity product, making sure to keep in mind all of your insights from the previous steps of the process. You come back to this step again and again after user testing, and generally it's the last two steps of the process that are iterated over the most. So just remember, iteration is for optimization, and the more you iterate, the better your product is going to be. But at the same time, make sure it is keeping in mind the limitations and the costs of going through and changing everything through the project. And yeah, here's the human-centered design process again, as we went through the analysis. So understanding and refining, and then going to design, figuring out what you're making and how you're making it, and then testing on it, and then finally implementing it, and going through that process iteratively. Yeah, and the attendance word is Sodalis.